What's up and how do you like your eggs? Because I like mine over quota. That's right, we've got a new big run inbound, and these are some overfishing tips to help get you that big run badge or that gold Ouroboros statue. So if your end goal is either the badge or that statue in this big run, make sure that you are overfishing as much as possible to make sure that you get up into that top 5%. And these tips should make it a little bit easier in order to reach that number. Since we don't have a definitive egg number to reach, we gotta make sure that we're doing as much overfishing as possible to get the highest egg number as possible. And in this video, I have 3 tips to keep in mind while you're doing your work for Grizzco in order to help succeed. Before I get into the tips, let's just cover a little bit of the basics on salmon running and trying to overfish. The idea of overfishing is to get as many eggs as possible. You're not worried too much about the quota, but you need to be worried more about getting eggs in as efficiently as possible. Big runs are wildcards, which give you a completely random weapon and a small chance for having a Grizzco weapon. And for this big run, it will be the Grizzco Brella. And during wildcards, it makes it so that we don't exactly have a perfect composition in order to reach our priority targets on the shoreline, or to eliminate lessers that are on the field in order to make it easier to do our work. So as always with Salmon Run, make sure you pay attention to what's in the composition and what can reach those priority targets and take them out the quickest. Try to be as efficient as possible, so that way you can take out those enemies and stay off the shoreline where it's the most dangerous. We want to stay as close to the basket as possible, and so painting as much on the walls or the turf makes it easier to get up to higher platforms where we can get away from these salmonids. Even the smallest ink strip on the wall can be extremely useful at the beginning and at the end of a wave, and sometimes even through the whole match. And since there's no AI that targets our ink, there's the chance that some of that ink will remain and be usable at any moment. So once we have the area painted, and we have the shoreline priority targets dealt with as quick as possible, we can get back to the basket, which brings me to my first tip, luring bosses. If you see anybody talking about salmon run tips, there's usually 2 things that you'll see people bring up, and it's both painting and luring. In the first half of the match, as long as the hazard level isn't too high, you can usually remain right there by the basket, bringing every single target that can be lured as close to the basket as possible. That way you can put the eggs in 1, 2, 3, instead of having to juggle them, passing one after the other. Sometimes in salmon run matches, it gives us all shoreline priority targets. At that point, notice what your teammates are doing and if they're getting down there to the shoreline. Protect them, and hopefully they'll start tossing eggs to you. That way you can run them as quick as possible to the basket. That way you can basket them as quick as possible, just in case another lureable target shows up. We have some instinctual reactions whenever we're trying to stay alive, and sometimes when we're down there by the shoreline, we'll instinctually throw bombs into maws or stall scrappers there by the shoreline. When you're trying to overfish, you have to get those bosses as close to the basket as possible. And even when this is happening, you have the potential of overluring. So during the last half of the match, you have to focus more on keeping your basket area clear instead of getting the bosses all the way to the basket. A big focus on taking out steel ills, steelheads, and slamming is needed in the last half of the match. These big targets can block your fire and keep you from taking out lessers or other bosses. I find myself sometimes having this way arguments with people because I want to get higher egg numbers when I'm just normally playing Salmon Run. But hopefully other players will care more on getting those higher egg numbers, and they will understand to get those targets all the way to the basket. And of course, to keep yourself from overluring and getting snowballed, make sure that you eliminate lessers all through the match. Try to make sure that you don't ignore them. If you just run down to the shoreline to grab an egg, make sure that you toss a bomb behind yourself, weakening a bunch and keeping that focus on luring those targets. And now that you lured those targets, you gotta make sure that you splat those enemies as quick as possible. And that gets us to tip number 2. In Splatoon 3, we have that awesome ability of throwing eggs. But we have to remember how much of a resource our ink is. It costs the same amount of ink to throw a bomb that it does to throw an egg. And if your basket area is clear, there's not too much of a reason to throw those eggs if they're that close to the basket. Egg throws work the best whenever you're dealing with shoreline priority targets. The best case scenario is that there's a big shot cannon, and then you can start launching those eggs. But when that's not the case, we have to make sure that we start juggling the eggs instead of running one egg at a time. It's extremely hazardous to juggle all 3 eggs, as it uses up too much ink, and you won't be able to focus too much on eliminating any other target while you're doing your egg running. And if ever you throw that egg and you reach completely empty on your ink tank, you have a longer delay until you get your ink back. So if you're running eggs from the shoreline, it's usually helpful to just run 2, But if you have a teammate that's helping you out or doing somewhat of a relay, you can run those 3 eggs usually pretty quickly. Just focus on getting your ink tank above the line, so that way whenever you throw the egg, you'll have a quicker ink recovery time, and you have a little bit of ink to protect yourself in case you need to paint your way out of there a little bit more. And one other dangerous thing that I have a tendency of doing and I have to be careful about is whenever we're in the latter half of the match and I have an egg in my hands, I have a tendency of throwing the egg in whenever I'm right by the basket, but the basket happens to be overflowing with enemies. You should probably focus a little bit more on keeping your basket area clear, also keeping an eye out for those latter half priority targets, which are slamlids, steelheads, and steel eels, in order to take out all those bosses and enemies, spawning all those eggs, making a mad run dash to getting all those eggs in the last few seconds. Try to think a little bit ahead of what your main thing is trying to do, and always multitask on both getting eggs in and eliminating enemies, so that way you can get more eggs in. And sometimes at higher hazards on a wild card, we have a really bad composition for keeping the area clear of lessers. And if that's the case, try to make sure that you keep the area painted, that way when you need an escape strategy, you have it ready to go. If you need to go in and grab an egg and it seems dangerous, as long as you have the area painted around it, try to see where you can squid roll to in order to both use that armor to block some of those hits, and to give you a little bit more momentum to reach some of those platforms or walls. There's a yin and yang when it comes to overfishing and salmon run. It's easier to get all the eggs in at a lower hazard because there's not as many lessers and there's less bosses. But unfortunately, there's not as many bosses that spawn in order to create more eggs in order to reach those higher numbers. So there's about a perfect rank for everybody to get to, where they can keep the area clear and keep the eggs running in order to reach those higher numbers. And the final tip I'll give you is ranking up to reach higher hazards. As you play more matches of Salmon Run, you have the potentials for having some sweet job scenarios show up. And if this big run works like the last big run does, we will have 3 different occurrences that we have the potential of having while we're playing our matches. And all the potential wave scenarios and occurrence scenarios that we have are all altered by our rank and hazard level. Luckily enough, these all max out before we hit our max hazard level, so we don't need to worry about getting all the way up there into max hazard level ranks. But you do want to focus on getting yourself to a hazard level where your job scenario will be just perfect for getting those high egg counts. Our 3 occurrences that we'll deal with is a mothership, a glowflies, and a grillers. And the way that these occurrences and waves are affected by our hazard level changes how many bosses spawn at a time and how quickly. So one of the best things to keep in mind is starting that rotation as soon as it happens in order to get those ranks up as quick as possible. Even if you get up there into the 400 or 600 EVP range, that gives you some wiggle room in case you have a really bad job scenario that gives you a pay cut. But if you have a match that gives you all really easy lures at a high hazard, you have all of these eggs so close to the basket, and it's so easy to hit those higher numbers. So towards the beginning of starting a rotation, try to focus as much as possible on making sure that you don't have a wave 1 or wave 2 loss. Make sure that you use those specials whenever things are getting sticky. Keep that pay grade and try to keep yourself ranking up and experiencing as many job scenarios as possible. Most of the things that are affected in the occurrences whenever we have a higher hazard are the speed of the enemies, which gives you more chances of taking out that Goldie, the Griller, and it makes those Chinooks super duper speedy whenever they're coming in from the mothership. And if we find ourselves on a high tide mothership, it's a blessing in disguise. Because those Chinooks are so close to the basket, as long as we can keep a focus on keeping the area clear and running those eggs, it's very easy to get our numbers up into the 50s. Once the big run gets going, we can try out some of these positions in order to find some good platforms, in order to stay away or lead the horde on a glowflies, or a great spot to lead that griller in order to expose his weak spot. But usually leading that griller as close to the basket is usually the most helpful. As long as you stay on chum and small fry control during these waves, eliminating as many bosses as possible, you can get some pretty high egg numbers in the 40s and 50s. So those would have to be my main 3 tips that I'd have to give you. Luring, egg running / painting, and of course, having as many matches as possible so that you can have as many job scenarios happen as possible. Focus on hyper luring in that first half of the match, and then keeping your basket area clear so that you can keep egg running in the second half of the match. Use your specials in order to clear the basket area, or to take out some priority targets that are becoming too much of a nuisance. And I do have one extra tip for you, and I usually say this in most of my tip videos, but remember that the salmonids have to use the turf in order to get to you, except for moths. So always make sure you're aware about where the fish stick locations are and what walls around the map that are paintable. Swim jumping allows you to clear a surprising amount of distance, And if what you're jumping to is a little bit below you, you have some extra distance that you can clear in order to reach it. Jumping from a fish stick to a salmon lid, in order to reach another target, and other smart ways like cutting corners and jumping over chasms of enemies are extremely useful in both reaching some of those targets and keeping yourself alive. The more time that you or your teammates are down is less time that you can spend running eggs. So that covers all the tips. But I do want to cover a potential hypothetical tip, just in case you haven't seen any information about our new king salmonid. This dragon-looking beast is known as Ouroboros, and it has a higher HP than our Kohozuna does. But one thing to keep in mind, he'll start to charge some kind of energy attack, and that is our chance to attack him in order to cause it to backfire and to cause some supreme damage to that king. So as it always goes, try to keep your focus tight, but not so tight that you have tunnel vision. Multitasking always makes it really easy to break away from one of those tasks so you can focus a little bit harder on something else, or to have to switch gears in order to revive someone, or to activate a special. Play as much of the big run as you possibly can to get as many job scenarios as possible, and good luck on those matches, guys. Alright, bye-bye. All right.